Remarkable things happen when a seed is planted. Because a little seed can grow into a large tree, one that produces fruit and feeds others year after year, a place where children play on its branches, a shelter where people find some shade and rest. The gospel is like a tiny seed. Once planted and established, it changes everything. It advances the common good for each person and place in our city. It makes good neighborhoods great. Friends become family. Hands become generous. Work becomes mission. It reconciles races and relationships. It makes art and media more hopeful. As it takes root, the gospel makes all things new. In 1981, a group of people met together in a garage and a gospel seed was planted that we know today as Green Lane Christian Center. God grew that small seed into a church that provided new life and shelter for thousands. Our city needs more trees, bigger trees. During those 35 years, our city has doubled in size. There are people and places in our city that need gospel seeds planted. It's time once again to sow. Between now and the end of 2020, we're focusing on 3 areas. To sow seeds in new fields right here in New Zealand that currently have very little access to the hope of Jesus. An expanded gospel center that provides better spaces for us to connect with God, each other, and our searching guests. And you. You are the leader, the neighbor, the carer, the culture maker, the co-worker, the teacher, the student. Who you are, how you communicate, how you relate to others, how you do your work, what you make, what you create, that proclaims, points, and partners with the gospel. Remarkable things happen when a gospel seed is planted, and the time for sowing is now.
So today's quite a significant day as we bring together a whole lot of reflections we've had during this month. 3 weeks ago, many of us planted some seeds. We came forward, planted some seeds in some pots at the front, and they're really growing, aren't they? In just 3 weeks. And when you came in, there's a little wee, plant house or whatever you want to call it out there with a whole lot of plants that the seeds we planted all beginning to grow. I'm guessing in a couple of weeks there'll be something edible from these. And I hope it reminds us of what happens when you plant a seed in the right conditions, with soil and water and light, all those type of things, it grows. And the reason we want to reflect on that is because Jesus took a seed that one day and he said a kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed planted in a field. Smallest of all seeds, but it becomes the largest of garden plants. It grows into a tree and birds come and make nests in its branches. And he wasn't just talking about, these type of seeds. He wants us to think about gospel seeds. When you plant gospel seeds in the right conditions and the right factors, they grow and they produce fruit and shelter for generations to come. So we've looked at a few of these factors, like the seed factor, that are meant to be a group of people and a church that renews people and places. We have to have the right seed in our hands. It's the gospel. Gospel is wide in its scope, radical in its implications. We've looked at the foundations factor, that if we're to renew people and places, we need to have the right foundations ourselves, to go deep into truth, to go deep ourselves, to be equipped and then mobilized to be gospel carriers to others. Last week, we looked at the love factor. The love demands we take whatever steps we can to meet the need. And when this sort of love sees a need and has the ability to do something, love acts. It steps out regardless of the cost, regardless of the risk. Today, I'm going to look at another factor necessary to grow gospel seeds, and that's faith. Now, whenever I mention the word faith, normally there's this kind of wacky ideas that come through about faith, a whole lot of confusion out there. So to help us today, I want us to turn to God's Word, to a chapter that's all about faith in the Bible. It's the book of Hebrews. It's in the New Testament. And Hebrews chapter 11. As you journey through the chapter, you come across Bible name after Bible name after Bible name It's kind of like all the big shots of the faith scene all coming together in this one chapter. Scholars often call it the Hall of Faith. The Hall of Faith. And it's possible that when you see these people and all these characters together, you might get the idea that these are the kind of the superheroes of the faith scene, because they do like all these amazing things. Before we come to it, though, I thought we could just have some fun together and think about some superheroes. So here's an activity for you. You're going to have to stand up, one of those things we hate, standing up and talking to other people, about stuff. But here's an activity. If you could choose one superpower for yourself, what would it be? It's going to be a list of superpowers on the screen to stimulate your thinking. A little hard to see these, so I'll read these out. And you can come up with your own anyway. So invisibility, deflection, force field, superhuman strength, eat anything and not gain weight, manipulate time, fly, laser eyes, make sermons shorter, but anyone here would want that, control weather, sonic scream, mind control, or falling off a bike without breaking your ribs and collapsing your lung. So it's a long story behind that one. We'll come to that. You can stand up, share about, what would be your superpower that you'd have? So stand up, talk. You've got about a minute or two to do this. What superpower would you choose out of that list, or make up one yourself that you really wish that you could have? Okay, grab a seat. My 3-year-old Giselle says that her superpower that she actually has is cuteness, which is pretty cute, really, isn't it? The smile certainly works on me. That last one that I mentioned, obviously, comes out of my journey lately, falling off a bike without breaking your ribs, collapsing your lung. That would be pretty good, because that's what happened to me, this last week. And that's why I wasn't in the poverty cycle yesterday. Pastors do radical things to get themselves out of big 50K rides. But, I'm still here, so it could be worse. But wouldn't it be cool to actually have one of these superpowers? To not just, be a costume hero, but a real one. Love that. And bringing that into our Christian lives, I think we tend to think about people who do really great things for God, and we think of them as almost as superpowers. Superheroes with these superpowers, people who are just incredibly gifted and godly, unlike the rest of us. But if you actually look at these, superheroes of the Bible, the big shots of the faith world, my hunch is that you'll think about people like Abraham, often referred to as the father of faith. You'll think about people like Noah, who built the ark, David and his battle with Goliath, Moses, who was instrumental in bringing all the plagues on Egypt, Joshua and the walls of Jericho that collapsed around him. We think of them as, superheroes with these superpowers, but what happens in Hebrews 11, this hallway of faith, is the writer brings all of these, famous faith people together. It's like the Bible's equivalent of the movie Avengers. And what we learn, first of all, actually, as we stand back and look at the big picture here, is that these famous faith superheroes were actually quite ordinary. The superhero has folks who have this inherent trait, inherent superhero strength. In the real world of the Bible, these superhero folks were not in themselves great people. For one, they had huge limitations. Moses stuttered. Gideon, at least at the very beginning of his journey, was an utter wimp. Joshua needs to be told several times to be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous, presumably because he wasn't. On top of all that, they don't have a perfect past. David was an adulterer. Moses, a murderer. Abraham gave his wife away twice. Noah got drunk and his daughter slept with him. Rahab had been a prostitute. Samson loved a prostitute. They're very ordinary people. The reason these people make it into this hall of faith comes down to one factor. The factor we're looking at today, this faith factor. They displayed faith. It has nothing to do with their natural abilities, nothing to do with their connections, nothing to do with their background, simply that they responded in faith to God's call upon their lives. And the rest, as they say, is biblical history. See, Hebrews 11 is all about how faith enables ordinary people to do something extraordinary. Now, I want to be upfront too, that when we look at chapters like this, often we think about them as kind of a tilting the hat to some kind of history, kind of respecting the past. But it's not written to do that. It's written to inspire ordinary people like you and me to also live by faith. This idea that when we have faith, ordinary people like you and me can also do something extraordinary. Again, as soon as I mention this idea of faith, most of us conjure up all sorts of ideas about what faith is and isn't. But what does it mean for us to actually live by faith in the real world? How does it work? So I'm going to come to Hebrews 11 and look at the type of faith that enables ordinary people to do something extraordinary. The first thing we see is that such faith doesn't seem sensible. We read, faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. See, the type of faith that makes ordinary people do something extraordinary doesn't seem sensible. Like it says here in the text, it's based on what we hope will actually happen, which means it hasn't happened yet. It's expressed when the circumstances aren't necessarily pointing in the sensible direction. You know, we like to see how everything is going to work out ahead of us, and it's great to do that, but it's not faith. Faith is when we can't see how it will work its way out. And as educated people, we rely on planning, don't we? We rely on seeing. We put our spreadsheets together, we calculate the risk before we step out. We study the circumstances around us. People of faith, we read, apparently move forward when it's actually not all that obvious how it's going to work out. Maybe their circumstances say actually the complete opposite from what faith says we should do. And the writer of Hebrews gives some illustrations of this kind of faith. It's almost like various exhibits in his hall of faith. Exhibit A, he says, it was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God who warned him about things that had never happened before. By his faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world, and he received the righteousness that comes by faith. Noah obeys the unreasonable. Imagine being Noah. God tells you to spend your whole life building an ark, this boat, because the whole earth is going to be flooded. Even though such a thing, we read, has never happened before. He tells us to sell everything you have and to gather 2 of every animal on the planet. It sounds unreasonable. And for decades, Noah endured ridicule from people all around him who just think he's plain nuts. But Noah does it. He obeys the unreasonable. And this nutcase becomes a hero right here in Hebrews 11. Then there's Exhibit B, Abraham and Sarah, who believed the unbelievable. It was by faith, we read, that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. God tells Abraham to go to this promised land. He doesn't tell him where that land is. Apparently, the GPS coordinates would activate once he begins moving. It's like, no, I'm sure his friends would consider Abraham nuts. So where are you going, Abraham? I have no idea, but God's going to show me, I guess. God also made a promise to Abraham and his wife Sarah. It's by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. And so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. There's a description. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand in the seashore, there is no way to count them. God makes this promise that a whole nation would descend from the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, but obviously the one problem exists at that point. They have no children, and they're not spring chickens. When this promise is given, Abraham was 100 years old. Sarah is 90. They believe the unbelievable. And then Exhibit C, Moses. He sacrificed beyond the rational. was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. So Moses was raised as a prince of Egypt, the most wealthy and powerful nation on the planet at that time. And for 40 years, he enjoyed the best of everything he wanted. Absolute power, limitless wealth, constant enjoyment. People wanted to be just like Moses. And yet at 40 years of age, God intervenes in Moses' life. And he gives Moses a choice to stay as one of the rulers in Egypt or actually say yes to God's call in his life to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, even though he had no idea how that could happen. So each of these stories shows us that faith does not always appear to be the sensible choice. At the time, it didn't seem sensible for Noah to invest decades of his life to build some ark, for Abraham to leave what he knew for some random place, for Moses to trade the comfort and security of the palace for helping the people of God. At the place of their choice, they had no idea what they were saying yes to. Circumstances would shout out, don't do it. Faith is shouting out, go for it. Live the adventure. Now, when I talk about faith, ordinary people doing something extraordinary by faith, some of you might get this idea that faith is like some kind of random substance. But the faith that allows ordinary people to do something extraordinary isn't some random substance. It's simply a trust based on something, or actually more better, someone. See, when I hear some people talk about faith, it often comes across to me like a faith in faith rather than a faith in God. The idea almost is that if we just kind of whip up enough faith, then what we're hoping for will happen. If we just gather enough people around us that can all believe the same thing and we kind of believe it into being, well, then it's going to happen. For instance, you might be sick, and people in this boat think that if you have enough people around you and they're all kind of believing the same thing and none of them have any doubt whatsoever, it will tip the outcome from a negative one to a positive one, and you'll get what you're faithing into being. It's almost like some currency. The more faith currency you have, the more probable what you want you will receive. So if you're single and you've finally met Mr. Right, but the problem is that he's dating someone else. So you pray something like, God, I pray that you will break things up with her so that he can meet me and we can live happily ever after. And you gather your friends around you and you say, let's just kind of believe this into being, that it's going to break up and we can be together like we should be. And then it's just going to happen. But effectively, this is just a potent mixture of intellectual and emotional self-control. It's a faith and faith version of positive thinking, of willpower, of speaking something into being. It happens all around us. There's absolutely nothing to do with the solid biblical faith we see in these characters, expressed in Hebrews chapter 11. You see, Christian faith, biblical faith, is based on who God says he is and what God says he will do. The reason Noah built an ark was on the basis that God said there would be a flood, and God told Moses to build an ark. So Noah simply believes who God says he is and what God told him to do. He just does it. He doesn't rally up enough faith in the ark into being. He doesn't, whip up enough faith for the flood to happen. He just trusts in what God has already said will happen. The reason Joshua saw the walls of Jericho come down is not because he just believed the walls to come down. He simply believed in what God said he would do and obeyed what God called him to do. See, people who do great things for God and live out, way over their heads, do so not because they're great themselves, but because they have a great God and they believe in what God has told them. As the Apostle Paul said, faith comes from hearing, and hearing from the Word of God. It's based on who God is, what God says he will do. I've been watching the seed sprout in the foyer at the plant house out there, and amazed at how all the plants kind of lean into the light that's streaming through the windows in the foyer. I wonder if faith is like that. It leans in God's direction. It tilts towards what God has promised can happen. tilts in the direction of the one who's able to take something so insignificant, allow us to grow and do something that produces life and fruit. There's another observation I see about faith in this chapter. Such faith is often accompanied by doubt. I often hear people say that faith and doubt are complete opposites. Even in that classic movie, Shrek, we hear the donkey sing, "I'm a believer, not a trace of doubt in my mind." We often think as Christians that faith and doubt can't coexist together. So let's kind of look again at Hebrews 11. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. And you can read that and think that there's zero doubt in all of her story. That's not the case. You go right back to the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, and we read the whole story, and we see there was a lot of doubt in her mind. When God tells her there's going to be a child, she mockingly laughed as if it was some great joke. A year later, a baby is born, and he's named Isaac. Isaac means laughter, a reminder that, she had some doubt about this whole thing. But even amidst the doubt, as she leaned into God and believed what would happen, this baby comes to be. We read about Moses' life, and you read about a guy who struggled with fear, who struggled with self-doubt tremendously. God calls him to go to Pharaoh, and he chickens out, and he gets his brother to go as the spokesman because he is afraid of the way he comes across, the way he speaks. See, all these people have a mixture of trust and terror, fear and faith. I'm guessing a whole lot of us have been up at the observatory at Sky City or a place like that before, and there's that thick glass they have up there, and you have the opportunity to stand on that glass and look down at the city way, way below. I love the way, I often sit back and just watch people approach the glass. A lot of people, grab hold of the rail and kind of like cautiously, kind of check that it's all okay, and then finally kind of allow themselves to kind of stand on that, but still kind of, holding onto that rail or holding onto the hand of somebody else. And then there's other people who just like casually kind of just walk along like it's no big deal and look down and, start to jump up and down on this thing. That's what my kids do. I'm more like the rail person, trying to check the whole thing before I, commit to it. But either way, we all end up, whether we're holding on, shaking, or courageously, we all end up on the glass. See, faith is like that. We might be really cautiously holding onto someone else's hand, or we might be pretty confident. But we're all trusting the glass to hold us. See, faith and doubt can coexist at the same time. It doesn't mean that we have fearless or zero doubt. It just means that we push through our fear. See, most people believe their doubts and doubt their beliefs. But why? Doesn't it actually make more sense to actually believe your beliefs and doubt your doubts? So when you say, God never can use me to renew my workplace or my home or my neighborhood, who told you that? Well, doubts did. But you can doubt and then we tend to doubt our beliefs rather than doubt our doubts. What we should do is see through the eyes of faith. Doubt can exist at the same time, but we trust our beliefs that we have and actually believe what the Bible says, that God wants to use you and that he had a plan for you right before you were even born on this planet to step into that very purpose. I remember a couple of years ago taking Chase for a swimming lesson, and he was really terrified at the thought of going under the water. He was fine in the pool. He was, fine holding on to the edge or even, standing in the pool as long as his head was well above the water. But the thought of having to float on his back at the risk of sinking, absolutely no way, Jose. His instructor by the name of Sheldon was fantastic. On the second day, I remember how Sheldon looked Chase square in the eyes and said, Chase, I'm going to promise you something. And I want you to know I never break my promises. I promise to hold you up and I will not let you go. Do you believe me? Chase was like shaking in the pool, and he looks at him and utters this very quiet, nervous, yes. Chase then slowly, Sheldon said to him, well, I want you to let go of my arms and lay flat on your back as I hold you. Chase slowly, yet very nervously did just that. Was he afraid? Oh yes, he was still shaking. But even though he was afraid, he believed Sheldon would hold him. And based on that belief, he let go. See, maybe God has you in a place right now where you feel nervous. And you still want to cling to the side of the pool. You want to be in this safe place where no trust is needed. And God is wanting you to live the adventure of swimming. He wants you to let go. He's cheering you on. He's whispering in your ear, I never break my promises. Will you trust me to do what I promised to do? I just want you to let go and lean back. Leads to another point I want to make about faith. Such faith acts. It's not some intellectual thing where we just sit back and talk about something. Real faith acts. So when God tells Noah to build an ark, Noah's faith is expressed in actually building the ark. When God calls Abraham to leave Ur, his faith is expressed in him leaving Ur and heading off to the promised land. When Chase was learning to swim, he could nod as much as he wanted and say to Sheldon he trusted him, but unless he acted on that trust and tilted his head back into the water based on the belief that Sheldon would hold him, it's not faith. Eventually, you have to stop clinging to the swimming teacher and swim. A great example of this is in the story about Joshua. Joshua has just taken over from Moses, who was the leader before of the people of Israel. Joshua's job now was to lead Israel into the promised land. But it's a tall order because the promised land is full of enemies. There are 7 nations there, all more powerful and stronger with real armies and real fortified cities. No wonder God had to keep saying to Joshua, be strong, be courageous. Joshua had already stepped out in faith. He had led the people across this flooded Jordan River, but the very first obstacle they come to is Jericho. This huge fortified city that was considered undefeatable. All the odds were against the people of God. Only an idiot would place a bet on the children of Israel. But God told Joshua what to do. He told them to walk around the walls of Jericho every day for 7 days. And then on the 7th day, to take some trumpets, that's all. Take some trumpets, walk around, blow the trumpets, get all the people to scream really loud, and then the walls will just come crashing down. And that's it. Now, I would imagine some of the people in the community are chatting behind Joshua's back, kind of saying, this guy's a Fruit Loop. Why did he ever get this role? I mean, really, that's his plan? Just to march around the city and wait for the walls to crumble? And yet they did it. It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came crashing down. It's the most ludicrous story. But they stepped out, acted out on this, what God has said would happen. That if they just obeyed, God would show up and it would have this awesome story to tell. Their faith was expressed in action, even doing the most silliest of things. One final lesson here about faith. Such faith pleases God. Hebrews 11 tells us that the only way God is pleased is by faith. It's impossible, it says, to please God without faith. Apparently, God isn't all that interested until we respond by faith, and then he moves. He's waiting to work in our lives, but he waits for us to respond with faithful obedience. His power is limitless, his resources always there, but it goes to people who exhibit faith. People who do great things for God don't do so because they're great themselves, but because they're simply acting on who they believe God is and what God has already spoken. They move forward when others would not. Such people see a need or sense God urging them to do something, and instead of looking at the thousand of reasons why they should never do it, they choose instead to move forward anyway. Faith takes the leap when most people just stay on the precipice looking over the edge. This faith factor from Hebrews 11 teaches us faith enables ordinary people to do something extraordinary. And again, let me remind you that this chapter isn't in the Bible to give us a history lesson on the past, but to inspire us about what faith looks like in practice today among you and me. So what does it look like in practice to come face to face with sickness or issues in relationships or challenges at work? It might be opportunities, it might be difficulties. I tend to sift through three questions. First, what would God say about this situation? Does it fit with kind of biblical mission and kingdom ethics? Second question, what does and doesn't God promise? Remember, faith is based on who God says He is, what God says He will do. It's not something I just kind of whip into being, believe it into being, speaking it into being. It was what God said. And third question, then what does it actually mean to act on these promises? Let's kind of sift that through Renew, because that's what we've been reflecting on this month in a whole range of ways. I get excited about Renew because it's this opportunity for us to actually step out in faith. I'm going to sift it through those questions. What would God have to say about this? Well, it comes from a kingdom desire. It's tilted towards others. It's not about our own comfort, but a desire to see the gospel at work in people and places in our city. To see people come to know Jesus and grow in that relationship. We know that when love sees a need, we do something about the need. Love steps out, it acts. It's consistent with what God says, isn't it? Biblical vision, mission, and values. Second question. Well, what does and doesn't God promise when it comes to actually stepping into that and giving of funds? Well, I haven't heard God promise to send money from heaven. You'll never hear me say from the front, I just claim this amount, I kind of believe it into being, because that's just ridiculous. God hasn't promised that. What God does say is He gives us individually the resources, and He encourages us to be generous, and He promises to provide what each of us will need. So He says things like this: God will generously provide all you need. Then you will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others. For God is the one who provides seed for the farmer, then bread to eat. In the same way, He will provide and increase your resources and then provide a great harvest of generosity in you. A couple of chapters after the one we'll be looking at, He says, don't love money. Be satisfied with what you have, for God has said, I will never fail you, I will never abandon you. Similar to what Sheldon said to my son Chase. So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, so I will have no fear. In other words, we can give, and we can give generously because we believe in faith that God will provide what we need. If I simply look at things from a human perspective, I might come up with a pledge, then look at the figure in horror as I think about what else I could do with that money. And I'm just speaking here of my own experience. Robin and myself discussed a figure earlier, and then looked at that again last night, and kind of came to a new figure again. And I have to admit, I looked at that again this morning as I filled out the pledge card and started to think about other things I could do with that money. And questions started to come through my mind about, well, should we be setting aside more for our retirement? And do we have enough safety buffer in our lives? And, all these different questions go through those compartments in our mind, don't they? And if I listened to those doubts, I would reduce it. But then I'm reminded of what God says, who God says He is, what God says He will do. And on the basis of that, I'm able to say, God, okay, here I am. I need you to be my security. But I'm still nervous about what that looks like. I would like to keep more back for myself, but I'm trusting that you will continue to provide for me and my family. I can't see how all this works its way out, but I choose to trust you. And here's the final question. So what does it actually mean to act on these promises? Well, for Renew, it means that, I can have doubts, I can have fears, but my faith's actually expressed when I fill out that pledge card, I place it in the buckets, and I arrange for, the giving or the electronic payment or whatever to come through it, whatever the commitment is. Faith is expressed in real-life opportunities by very ordinary people like you and me. It's expressed in the simple things we do to plant kingdom seeds that will grow and sprout and bring life for generations to come. God responds to faith. So during this month, I've shared a 2020 vision with you. As your pastor, my role is simply to present the need and to give every opportunity to you to respond. We've had Q&As, small group meetings, lots of prayer times, devotional guide to enable you to talk with God about what's happening. What happens now is between you and God. In a moment, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to fill out the pledge cards that were on your seats when you came in. The card represents for me a moment of faith. It's an opportunity to actually practice what we believe. To say, God, would you take this commitment, this gift, and enable gospel seeds to grow in the lives of others for generations to come? For me, this process has once again sparked a whole bunch of questions in my life. What is most important to me? And I'm surprised at how much material things still matter to me way too much. It's forced me to face that. And now we get this opportunity to step in. Whatever God provides through people today will determine how far we get to go together. Now, you might be a guest here today, or it may be that you've already completed a pledge card, or that you won't be completing a pledge card for whatever reason. I just encourage you to use these couple of minutes while other people are filling out their pledge cards to reflect on those other situations in your life that you need to step out in faith and actually believe in who God says He is and what God says He will do and apply it to those situations. For the rest of us, wonder if you can take these cards for a moment. I want to walk you through some specifics so we know exactly what it looks like. There's some buckets at the end of the aisle. So if you can pass those now, just to make sure everyone has a pen that wants a pen. There's also some offering envelopes in the bucket so that if people are wanting to make a check or a cash offering today around this, you can grab one of these. And we'll talk about that in a moment. On this pledge card, just highlight, hopefully you can read everything on there. It's got your contact details for obvious reasons. Has right at the top there, my total amount I'm pledging or committing over the next 2 years is, and you kind of fill that out. And then further down here, it talks about how those payments work. And the reason we're asking you to fill that in is if you're, staggering this over, weeks, months, a couple of years, it just helps us as a leadership team to know, but when can we expect that? It helps us to modify our planning around that to kind of manage our cash flow in the projects that we're committing to do. It might be that you're wanting to make a payment towards your pledge today. And whatever means you use, just make sure your donor number or name is on that. So if it's on the giving envelope, that you kind of write Renew on here somewhere to specify it's going towards Renew. And if you can do that every week from here on in as well. So it doesn't get confused with our normal giving, because we really want this to go towards the 2020 vision that we're talking about. Or if you're giving to through PushPay, which is through our church app, or through FPOS or credit card or electronic banking, just make sure it has Renew on it. And then just make sure it has your own contact details on it too, so that at the end of each tax year, you can get up to a third of that back, maximize your giving and getting that back as well. I'm going to give you a few minutes now, and I think this can be a time of worship, just as you fill in the pledge card, or as you sit here and just think about what that looks like in any area of your life as we step out in faith. And during that, our team is going to lead us in a pretty cool instrumental piece.